In the brutal, blood-soaked dirt of the Jezreel Valley, a prophecy was fulfilled with a surgical, grotesque precision that defies all natural explanation. The year is somewhere around 842 BC. The military commander Jehu has just ordered the Queen of Israel to be thrown from the high window of her winter palace. Her blood splatters against the stone walls and violently coats the hooves of the war horses that trample her dying body into the mire. But the true horror of this event is not the assassination itself. Political murders were common in the ancient Near East. The true horror lies in the absolute supernatural erasure of her existence. Jehu, having executed the sovereign architect of Israel's corruption, steps inside the palace to eat and drink. Hours pass. Later, he casually orders his men to bury her out of a lingering respect for her royal Phoenician bloodline. But when the soldiers arrive at the courtyard, the corpse is gone. The ancient Hebrew text of 2 Kings chapter 9 records a detail so chilling, so unnervingly specific, that it has haunted scholars and theologians for millennia. The stray dogs of the city had consumed her flesh, leaving behind only 3 distinct anatomical fragments: the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. This is not a myth, nor is it a dark fable. This is the stark, historical record of the most thoroughly eradicated human being in the biblical narrative. Why did the scavenging beasts of the field leave exactly the skull, the feet, and the palms? In the ancient Near Eastern understanding of ritual warfare and divine curses, these are not random remnants. They represent the total dismantling of human agency. The skull that conceived the destruction of the prophets of Yahweh. The feet that confidently walked the corridors of power to establish foreign altars. The palms of the hands that pressed the king's royal seal, signing the death warrants of innocent men and orchestrating the theft of Naboth's vineyard. The decree of the God of Israel was not merely that she would die, but that her very identity would be unmade. She was condemned to become indistinguishable refuse upon the face of the field, specifically so that no man could ever look at a tomb, a statue, or a monument and say, "This is Jezebel." Yet, the ultimate terrifying paradox of her divine punishment is that her physical eradication made her spiritually immortal. For centuries, modern culture and shallow religious traditions have drastically reduced this woman to a pathetic caricature. A cautionary tale about vanity. A manipulative, jealous wife. A mere footnote in the epic saga of the prophet Elijah. But the ancient texts and the archaeological strata of the Levant reveal something far more terrifying. She was not a mere consort. She was a geopolitical titan, a high priestess of the Canaanite pantheon, and the cold, calculating architect of the most sophisticated state-sponsored religious genocide recorded in the ancient world. She brought the worship of Baal and Asherah into the very heart of Israel, not as a quiet, private practice, but as a mandatory, blood-drenched state religion enforced by the sword. Her name itself operates as a dark incantation. In its ancient Phoenician origins, it is not merely a royal title, it is a taunting liturgical cry. It translates conceptually to a desperate plea to the heavens, an inquiry asking, "Where is the prince?" A direct, living invocation to Baal, the lord of the storm and the god of the dead. To truly understand her is to stare directly into the abyss of a spiritual war that transcends flesh, blood, and time itself. Even Elijah, the monumental prophet who called down fire from the sky to consume the altars of Mount Carmel, fled into the wilderness in absolute terror the moment she whispered a single threat against his life. Because her story does not end in the dirt of Jezreel. Over 900 years after the dogs consumed her flesh, her shadow falls heavily across the apocalyptic visions of the Book of Revelation. The resurrected Christ, speaking from the eternal throne to the early church of Thyatira, issues a terrifying warning about a prophetess teaching seduction and deep, occult idolatry. And he calls this new threat by one specific, unmistakable name: Jezebel. She is the singular, terrifying human figure in the biblical text, whose identity mutates from a historical flesh-and-blood queen into an eternal, autonomous spiritual principality, an ancient architecture of rebellion that refuses to stay buried. We are about to peel back the layers of sanitized, comfortable history. We will look at the undisputed archaeological evidence of her reign, the brutal reality of the Canaanite gods she served, and the ancient texts that document her relentless war against heaven. If you are prepared to step out of the shallow waters of modern tradition and seek the hidden truths of the ancient world, subscribe and join us in this investigation. The truth of the Forbidden Queen is far darker than you have been told, and her influence did not die in the courtyard. To understand the magnitude of the spiritual catastrophe that this queen brought upon the ancient world, we must first tear down the comfortable, sanitized illusions constructed by centuries of modern religious tradition. If you ask the modern churchgoer or the casual reader of history who she was, you will almost invariably be handed a shallow, moralistic caricature. Western civilization has reduced her name to a mere synonym for a difficult, manipulative woman. She is preached from pulpits as a cautionary tale about vanity, painted faces, and jealous wives who lead their husbands astray. This is not merely an oversimplification. It is a fundamental betrayal of the historical text and a dangerous underestimation of the cosmic war documented in the Hebrew Scriptures. The ancient scribes did not dedicate significant portions of the Book of Kings to warn men about domineering spouses. The prophets did not risk their lives, hiding in caves and starving in the wilderness, because the king had married a woman with a strong personality. The reduction of this figure to a domestic nuisance is a symptom of a modern mind that has lost all understanding of how the ancient world actually operated. In the ancient Near East, religion and state were not separate entities. They were the exact same mechanism. A nation's god was its ultimate sovereign, and the earthly monarch was merely the regent, the physical conduit through which the deity exercised power, maintained order, and distributed justice. To change a nation's god was not a matter of personal preference or private spirituality. It was an act of high treason. It was the complete dismantling of the foundational constitution of the state. Therefore, when we speak of this Sidonian princess, we are not speaking of a rebellious wife. We are speaking of a sophisticated, highly educated geopolitical titan who possessed an iron will and a staggering intellect. We are analyzing the life of a high priestess who orchestrated the most aggressive, systematic spiritual coup d'etat in antiquity. The stage for this apocalyptic collision was not a backward, irrelevant kingdom. This is another modern misconception that must be eradicated. When we imagine the biblical kingdom of Israel during the 9th century before Christ, we often picture a fragile, isolated tribe of herdsmen struggling to survive. The archaeological dirt of the Levant tells a completely different, terrifyingly grand story. The man she married, King Ahab of the Omride dynasty, was an absolute powerhouse of the ancient world. Assyrian records, specifically the Kirk monolith of Shalmaneser III, which now sits in the British Museum, document Ahab not as a weak, henpecked husband, but as a formidable warlord. In the colossal Battle of Karkar in 853 BC, the Assyrian Empire attempted to crush a coalition of Western kings. The ancient stone explicitly records that Ahab the Israelite provided 2,000 chariots and 10,000 infantrymen to the alliance. This was a massive, highly advanced military machine. Ahab was a builder of fortified cities, a master of trade routes, and a king whose wealth and military might commanded the respect of the surrounding empires. But a military machine requires infinite funding, and a kingdom surrounded by enemies requires impregnable alliances. This is the cold, calculated political architecture that led Ahab to the coastal strongholds of Phoenicia. To the northwest of Israel lay the twin city-states of Tyre and Sidon. These were not mere cities. They were the maritime masters of the Mediterranean, the architects of global commerce, the ancient equivalent of an untouchable financial empire. They controlled the shipping lanes, the distribution of precious cedars from Lebanon, the monopoly on the immensely valuable Tyrian purple dye extracted from murex shells, and the flow of silver and gold across the known world. To marry a princess of Tyre was to secure an unbreakable economic treaty, flooding Israel with unprecedented, staggering wealth. But the princess who was sent to Samaria was not a passive pawn in a political chess match. She was the daughter of a man named Ethbaal. To comprehend the darkness she carried into Israel, we must look at the bloodline of her father. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, preserving the ancient records of the Phoenician historian Menander of Ephesus, provides a chilling detail about King Ethbaal. He was not born to the throne. He was a high priest of the goddess Astarte. He seized the crown through violence, assassinating the reigning monarch, Pheles, to establish his own dynasty. He was a priest who became a king through the spilling of blood. This was the environment in which the young princess was forged. She was raised in the shadow of a usurper, educated in the ruthless mechanics of absolute power, and steeped in a religious system that demanded ultimate submission. The Phoenician religion was not a philosophy of personal enlightenment. It was an industrial, transactional mechanism of survival. They worshipped the Baalim, the lords of nature, the masters of the storm, the entities that controlled the rain, the harvest, and the fertility of the womb. At the center of this pantheon in Tyre was Melkart, the king of the city, a deity of the underworld, the dying and rising sun. The worship of these gods was visceral, bloody, and terrifyingly pragmatic. It involved temple prostitution, ecstatic frenzy, self-mutilation, and when the crises of famine or war reached a breaking point, the ultimate transaction of human sacrifice. When she traveled from the coastal splendor of Tyre to the hill country of Samaria, the capital of Israel, she did not view herself as an immigrant seeking assimilation.
She arrived as a sovereign missionary of the Phoenician pantheon, backed by the infinite wealth of her homeland and the political protection of her husband. Here, we encounter the fundamental collision of two incompatible universes. The God of Israel, Yahweh, was entirely unique in the ancient Near East. He was formless, uncreated, and demanded absolute exclusive covenantal loyalty. He did not operate on the transactional mechanics of nature.
He operated on righteousness, law, and historical memory. The covenant established at Mount Sinai was a suzerain vassal treaty, a legally binding contract where Yahweh was the great king and Israel was his possession. The first, foundational, non-negotiable clause of this cosmic contract was that no other gods could be brought before his face. Furthermore, this God explicitly forbade any physical representation of himself. The temple in Jerusalem, and even the corrupted shrines in the north, were built around an empty space, a vacuum of representation where the invisible presence rested. The Phoenician princess looked upon this invisible religion and saw only a vacuum waiting to be filled. She saw a fragmented kingdom that could be unified, controlled, and brought into the magnificent, cosmopolitan sphere of international worship. She did not ask Ahab for a small, private shrine to practice the religion of her ancestors in the quiet corners of the palace. That is the assumption of a modern mind accustomed to religious freedom. In the ancient world, there was no separation of church and state. To establish an altar was to establish a claim of sovereignty over the land. The Book of 1 Kings records that Ahab built a temple for Baal in Samaria, erected an altar, and constructed an Asherah pole, a stylized physical representation of the cosmic womb and the mother goddess, an entity directly associated with fertility and the regenerative powers of nature. This was a catastrophic, public violation of the Sinai covenant. It was a declaration that the God who had delivered the Israelites from Egypt was no longer sufficient to secure the prosperity of the state. But she did not stop at the construction of monuments. The biblical text reveals a logistical operation of staggering proportions. She imported hundreds of foreign priests into the capital. 1 Kings, chapter 18, documents 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at her royal table. We must deconstruct what this phrasing actually means. Eating at the royal table is not a metaphor for a polite dinner party. In the ancient administrative framework, to eat at the royal table meant to be fully funded, housed, and provisioned by the state treasury. She took the taxes, the grain, and the wealth of the Israelite people and used it to subsidize a massive state-sponsored priesthood dedicated to the very entities the God of Israel had ordered them to destroy. She transformed the worship of the Canaanite gods from an illicit, underground practice into the official, mandatory state religion of the Omride dynasty. Her authority in this matter was not merely derived from her husband's complacency. Archaeological discoveries have provided terrifying physical evidence of her administrative power. In the mid-20th century, the renowned Israeli epigrapher Nahman Avigad analyzed a large, exceptionally ornate opal seal discovered in the region. The seal is inscribed with ancient Paleo-Hebrew letters that spell out the letters YZBL. The iconography carved into the stone is entirely foreign to Israelite tradition. It features a sphinx with the body of a lion and the head of a woman, wearing the crown of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Above it is the winged sun disk, and below it, 2 cobras and the lotus flower. This is a masterpiece of royal Phoenician symbology, communicating absolute divine protection and unchallengeable royal authority. The size and magnificence of the seal indicate that it belonged to an individual of ultimate supreme executive power. In the ancient world, a seal was the equivalent of a signature, a biometric key that authorized the movement of troops, the execution of laws, and the transferring of wealth. The fact that she possessed a seal of this magnitude proves that she operated as a co-regent. She was not whispering suggestions into the ear of the king. She was stamping documents of state with her own authority, writing laws, and issuing edicts that carried the weight of life and death across the entire nation. The architecture of her reign was as physical as it was spiritual. The prophet Amos, preaching decades later, would condemn the houses of ivory built during this period. Excavations in Samaria have unearthed thousands of exquisite ivory carvings, remnants of luxurious furniture and wall panels, identical in style to Phoenician art. The capital city had become a monument to foreign wealth and foreign gods. The visual landscape of Israel had been entirely rewritten. The high places smoked with the fat of sacrifices offered to the lords of the storm. The sacred groves surrounding the Asherah poles became centers of ritualized sexuality, where the agricultural cycles were secured through acts of temple prostitution, a physical reenactment of the cosmic mating of the gods to ensure the fertility of the land. The invisible holy demands of Yahweh were replaced with the tangible, intoxicating, and sensory-overloading rituals of Canaan. It was within this environment of absolute, suffocating spiritual darkness that the friction between the state and the faithful remnant of Yahweh reached the point of ignition. The prophets of the God of Israel were not quiet, compliant clerics. They were the constitutional watchdogs of the covenant. They were fierce, uncompromising men who marched into the royal courts wearing garments of hair and leather, pointing their fingers at kings and pronouncing divine curses upon the land for the violation of the ancient laws. They were a political and spiritual threat to the synchronized cosmopolitan empire the queen was building. In her mind, the exclusivity of Yahweh was a primitive tribal superstition that stood in the way of progress, alliances, and absolute control. And so, she initiated an action that had absolutely no precedent in the recorded history of the ancient Near East. Before this moment, empires fought wars over territory, over water rights, over gold, and over slaves. A king might destroy a foreign temple to demoralize a conquered enemy, but the concept of hunting down and exterminating a specific group of people solely because of their theological beliefs was unheard of. The polytheistic world was inherently tolerant of multiple gods. There was always room for one more deity in the pantheon. But the God of Israel demanded everything, and therefore his prophets could not be assimilated. They could only be destroyed. The text of 1 Kings states bluntly that she cut off the prophets of the Lord. It is a horrific, violent verb. This was not a quiet silencing or a political exile. It was a systematic, brutal purge. She utilized the full military and intelligence apparatus of the Israelite state to hunt down the men who spoke for Yahweh. The sword of the executioner fell upon the high places and the hidden caves. We have a record of an official named Obadiah, a man who feared the God of Israel but managed to survive within the royal court, who secretly took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in caves, feeding them with bread and water at the risk of his own execution. The fact that they had to hide in subterranean darkness, surviving on the barest rations, illustrates the total, suffocating terror of her regime. She had transformed the Promised Land into a slaughterhouse for the servants of God. She is the first individual in recorded human history to invent and execute a state-sponsored religious persecution. She did not merely introduce idolatry, she weaponized the throne to exterminate the very concept of Yahweh from the face of the earth. This was no longer a political disagreement. This was a war of annihilation between the cosmic architecture of heaven and the demonic principalities of the earth. The covenant was broken. The blood of the righteous soaked the soil of Samaria. The smoke of Baal darkened the skies. The silence of the God of Israel seemed absolute, a deafening void that allowed the Queen's power to expand without check or boundary. The entire machinery of the ancient world had been bent to her will, and there seemed to be no human force capable of stopping the total erasure of the divine truth. Into this manufactured abyss of Canaanite darkness, a man steps out of the wasteland without warning, without a royal introduction, and without an army. He is a ghost from the rugged highlands of Gilead, a region of harsh terrain east of the Jordan River. His name is an absolute theological provocation. In the original Hebrew, he is Eliyahu. The name itself is a codified declaration of war. My God is Yahweh. He bypasses the bureaucratic machinery of the state, marches directly into the epicenter of Ahab and Jezebel's cosmopolitan empire, and delivers not a diplomatic petition, but a devastating legal injunction from the Supreme Court of Heaven. He does not ask the king for religious tolerance. He looks at the monarch who commands thousands of chariots and declares that there will be no dew nor rain in the coming years, except by his word. To the modern ear, a drought sounds like a severe meteorological event, a natural disaster that brings economic hardship. But we must read this through the lens of ancient Near Eastern theology to understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what Elijah just did. In the religious system that the Queen had violently imposed upon Israel, Baal was not merely a god. He was the rider of the clouds. The ancient Ugaritic texts, discovered on clay tablets in the ruined city of Ras Shamra, detail the exact jurisdiction of this deity. Baal was the sovereign lord of the storm, the master of lightning, the entity who opened the windows of heaven to fertilize the earth with rain. He was the guarantor of the agricultural cycle, the very source of economic and physical survival. By standing in the royal court and declaring that the sky would turn to iron and the earth to brass, Elijah was not predicting weather. He was executing a cosmic embargo. He was publicly paralyzing the highest god of the Phoenician pantheon, demonstrating that the deity the queen worshipped was entirely impotent, a prisoner locked inside a sky controlled by the invisible God of Israel. The drought that followed was not a gradual inconvenience. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling of the kingdom's life support. For 3.5 years, the heavens remained violently clear. The soil cracked into hard, necrotic webs. The brooks dried into dust. The mighty agricultural engine of Israel ground to a halt, replaced by the suffocating silence of starvation. The ancient texts paint a grim, almost surreal picture of the geopolitical desperation. King Ahab, the warlord who terrified empires, is reduced to wandering the barren ravines with his servant Obadiah, desperately searching for a patch of green grass to keep his war horses and mules from dying. The military machine was collapsing from dehydration. Yet while the king searched for grass, the queen did not repent. She doubled down on her slaughter, intensifying her hunt for the prophets of Yahweh, treating the drought not as a divine judgment, but as an act of spiritual terrorism committed by an enemy of the state. When the friction reaches its breaking point, Elijah returns and demands a gathering. He orders the king to summon all of Israel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, to Mount Carmel. The geographical choice is a stroke of strategic brilliance. Carmel is a massive, forested promontory that juts directly into the Mediterranean Sea. It sits on the borderlands, acting as a natural boundary between the territory of Israel and the coastal domain of Phoenicia. It was the contested high ground, a place where the altars of Yahweh had been torn down and replaced with the shrines of the storm god. It was the ultimate stage for a cosmic trial by fire. When the people of Israel gather on the mountain, they are a starving, emaciated, and spiritually fractured multitude. Elijah stands before them and issues a piercing indictment. He asks how long they will halt between two opinions. The original language used here is profound. The word for halting or hesitating implies a ritualistic limping, a chaotic, unbalanced dance. They are attempting to survive by keeping one foot in the covenant of Sinai and the other in the blood-drenched fertility cults of Canaan. Elijah forces a binary ultimatum. There will be no more synchronization. There will be 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, and 1 test. The God who answers by fire, the God who can actually manipulate the physical elements of the universe, is the true sovereign. The prophets of Baal accept the challenge. They are given the first opportunity. They build their altar, prepare the sacrificial bull, and begin their liturgy. From the morning until the blazing heat of noon, 450 men cry out into the silent sky. "O Baal, hear us." But the text records a chilling, absolute void. There was no voice, nor any that answered. As the sun climbs higher, their desperation mutates into frenzy. They begin to leap upon the altar they had made, engaging in the ecstatic, chaotic movements characteristic of Canaanite worship. It is at this moment that Elijah unleashes a weapon of psychological and theological devastation, pure, concentrated mockery. He stands on the mountain and tells the priests to shout louder. He suggests that perhaps their God is deep in thought, or perhaps he is busy or on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. This is not petty sarcasm. Elijah is weaponizing their own mythology against them. In the Ugaritic cycles, there is a myth where Baal descends into the underworld and is swallowed by Mot, the god of death. During the dry season, Baal is considered dead or sleeping in the abyss, and he must be violently roused by his sister, the warrior goddess Anat. Elijah is forcing the priests to confront the terrifying possibility that their god is a corpse. Pushed to the brink of madness, the prophets of the queen escalate their ritual to its ultimate, necrotic extreme. The Book of Kings records that they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. This horrifying act of self-mutilation is the core engine of ancient sympathetic magic. In the minds of the Canaanite priests, if the god of the storm is asleep or trapped in the realm of death, he lacks the vitality to answer. Therefore, the worshippers must become the battery. They must drain their own life force, their own hot, pulsing blood, and pour it into the dirt to jumpstart the dormant deity. 450 men, covered in their own gore, screaming in a chaotic symphony of pain, slashing their flesh open in a desperate transaction with the void. The mountain reeks of fresh blood and sweat under the burning, unforgiving sun. They continue this manic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice, but the spiritual reality remains terrifyingly inert. The text repeats the absolute emptiness of the idolatrous universe. There was neither voice nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. The heavens remain iron, the blood buys nothing. Then, as the shadows begin to lengthen, Elijah steps forward. He does not scream, he does not dance, he does not shed his own blood. He operates with the cold, precise mechanics of divine jurisprudence. He first repairs the altar of Yahweh that had been torn down by the queen's forces. He takes exactly 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of the sons of Jacob. In a kingdom that has been fractured by civil war and divided by idolatry, this architectural choice is a statement of covenantal unity. He is physically rebuilding the broken contract between God and his people. He then digs a trench around the altar and orders the people to bring 4 barrels of water, pouring them over the sacrifice and the wood. He demands they do it a second time, and then a third time. 12 barrels of water in a land that has not seen a drop of rain in over 3 years. Water at this moment is infinitely more valuable than silver. It is the very essence of survival. To pour it out is an act of economic madness and absolute surrender. The water drenches the meat, soaks the wood, and fills the trench to the brim. Elijah is intentionally engineering a scenario where natural ignition is physically impossible. He is removing every variable of human manipulation, every shadow of a doubt. There can be no hidden sparks, no tricks of the trade, no illusion. When the preparations are complete, Elijah approaches the altar. His prayer is astoundingly brief, containing only 63 words in the original Hebrew. He does not invoke the chaotic forces of nature. He addresses the God of history, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He asks for a singular vindication. Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. He is functioning as the prosecuting attorney of the divine court, asking the judge of the universe to issue a public, irrefutable verdict. The response is instantaneous and apocalyptic. The text states that the fire of the Lord fell. We must strip our minds of the image of a mere campfire or a lightning strike. The ancient language indicates an event of unmaking, a terrifying intrusion of the uncreated dimension into the material world. This fire did not merely burn, it annihilated. It consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. This defies every law of thermodynamics and physics. Fire does not consume solid rock and dirt. This was an antimatter-like manifestation of divine holiness, a localized flash of the terrifying glory that dwells in unapproachable light. The molecular structure of the altar itself was erased from existence, leaving only a scorched, smoking crater where the sacrifice had been. The people of Israel, witnessing the impossible, collapse on their faces in absolute terror, crying out the very meaning of Elijah's name. Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. The verdict has been rendered, and the ancient law of the covenant demands immediate execution. The prophets of Baal, the men who had eaten at the queen's table and slaughtered the innocent, are seized. Elijah brings them down to the brook Kishon at the base of the mountain. Here, the terrible bloody mechanics of holy war, the decree of utter destruction known in Hebrew as herem, is enacted. The 450 false priests are executed. The cancer is violently excised from the body of the nation. The soil of the Phoenician valley runs red, but this time, it is the blood of the deceivers. With the covenant temporarily restored and the spiritual treason punished, the cosmic embargo is instantly lifted. Elijah climbs back up the mountain, bows to the earth, and the sky finally breaks. The terrifying sound of the abundance of rain echoes across the Mediterranean. The heavens grow black with clouds and wind, and a torrential downpour strikes the dying land. Elijah, empowered by a supernatural surge of divine energy, runs ahead of King Ahab's chariot all the way to the gates of Jezreel. He has just orchestrated the greatest, most irrefutable theological victory in human history. The prophets of Baal are dead. The rain has returned, proving that Yahweh, not Baal, controls the storm. The people have repented. As he stands at the gates of the royal city, drenched in the miraculous rain, Elijah fully expects the total capitulation of the government. He expects the queen to flee, to surrender, or to be overthrown by the awakened populace. He expects the cosmic war to be finished. Ahab enters the winter palace and delivers the report to the queen. He tells her everything Elijah had done, detailing the fire from heaven and the execution of her entire priesthood with the sword. Logically, politically, and humanly speaking, this is the moment her empire collapses. Her gods have been publicly humiliated and proven non-existent. Her religious infrastructure has been annihilated in a single afternoon. Her husband, the king, is deeply shaken. The nation has witnessed an undeniable miracle. She is entirely isolated, but her reaction defies all human intuition, all political strategy, and all self-preservation. She does not panic. She does not pack her wealth and flee to her coastal fortress in Tyre. She does not raise the army. Instead, she summons a single messenger and sends him out into the rain to deliver a precise, terrifying oath directly to the prophet. The message is a masterpiece of dark, unyielding resolve. She says, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." To comprehend the sheer, chilling horror of this statement, we must analyze the spiritual mechanics of ancient oaths. In the Near Eastern legal framework, an oath sworn by the gods is an unbreakable, self-imprecatory contract. You are literally binding your own soul to a curse if you fail to execute your word. You are inviting your own destruction. The supreme paradox here is that she is invoking the very entities, the gods of Canaan, that have just been exposed as powerless, silent voids upon the mountain. She knows her priests are dead. She knows her altar is cold. Yet she weaponizes her own eternal damnation, binding herself to the abyss to guarantee the murder of the prophet. She is saying, "If I do not tear your life from your body by this exact hour tomorrow, may the underworld swallow me whole." This is the hinge upon which the entire mystery turns. We must look at the reaction of Elijah, the man of iron and fire. He had stood fearless before an enraged king. He had mocked a mob of 450 blood-crazed priests. He had called down the uncreated fire of God to vaporize stone. He was the most powerful, intimidating human being on the face of the earth. But when he hears the words of this one woman, something inside him violently fractures. The text records a sudden, catastrophic psychological collapse. It says, "And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life." Why? What did he see in that message that broke him so completely? It was not a simple fear of death. Elijah had been living under the threat of execution for years. He had walked into Ahab's court fully expecting to die. The terror that gripped him was not physical. It was deeply, profoundly existential. When the messenger delivered those words, Elijah did not just hear the anger of a defeated queen. He looked through the machinery of her oath and perceived the true nature of his enemy. He realized that the woman sitting in the palace was no longer operating as a mere human monarch defending a political position. The unyielding, irrational, cold-blooded purity of her hatred revealed that she was entirely possessed by and merged with an ancient, bottomless evil. Elijah realized that the victory on Mount Carmel had only defeated flesh and blood. He had slaughtered the human instruments, the 450 priests. He had proven the theology of Yahweh, but the dark, pulsing heart of the rebellion, the demonic principality that had built its throne within the soul of the Sidonian princess, remained completely untouched by the fire from heaven. The fire had consumed the altar of stone, but it had not consumed the abyss within her. She was a human architecture of rebellion that refused to bow, even in the face of absolute, undeniable omnipotence. The chilling realization that he was fighting an immortal entity wearing a crown of ivory shattered his mind. He fled into the desolate wilderness of Beersheba, leaving his servant behind, walking a day's journey into the deep desert until he collapsed under a solitary broom tree. The greatest prophet of the ancient world lay in the dirt, begging the God who had just answered him by fire to simply take his life, whispering into the dust that he was no better than his ancestors. He had stared into the void of the forbidden queen, and the void had stared back with an unwavering, terrifying silence. The terrifying silence of the wilderness of Beersheba is the exact location where our modern, rational understanding of the biblical narrative completely collapses. To the uninitiated mind, the flight of Elijah makes absolutely no logical sense. He had just slaughtered 450 men. He possessed the kinetic, lethal backing of the creator of the universe. Yet, a single sentence from a queen sitting in a palace stripped him of his prophetic armor and reduced him to a trembling mortal begging for the release of death. We are forced into a violent collision with a doctrinal paradox that the modern church has spent centuries desperately trying to suppress, sanitize, and explain away. The paradox is this: if God is absolutely sovereign, and if the prophets of Baal were nothing more than charlatans worshipping pieces of carved wood, why was the threat of Jezebel so palpably, existentially terrifying? Why did the fire from heaven not solve the problem? To answer this, we must tear down the comfortable post-Enlightenment theology that has infected the Western mind. For the last several hundred years, we have been systematically trained to read the ancient texts through the lens of modern materialism. We have turned the gods of the ancient world into metaphors, psychological archetypes, or primitive superstitions invented by ancient men to explain the weather. We have domesticated the supernatural. We sit in brightly lit, safe auditoriums and teach that the Israelites were merely struggling with bad habits and cultural peer pressure. This is a catastrophic theological failure. It is an insult to the blood of the prophets and a dangerous misrepresentation of the cosmic war documented in the scriptures. The ancient Hebrews did not view the gods of Canaan as imaginary constructs. They viewed them as unauthorized, highly dangerous, and fiercely intelligent cosmic entities. To understand the true nature of the enemy operating through the Phoenician queen, we must plunge into the deep, archaic theology of the divine council, a concept intricately detailed in the original Hebrew of Deuteronomy chapter 32, and confirmed by the ancient manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The biblical worldview is not a simple, two-dimensional battle between God and humans. It operates on a vast, multi-layered architecture of unseen administration. According to the ancient texts, at the event of the Tower of Babel, humanity united in absolute rebellion, attempting to build an architecture that would force the heavens to merge with the earth on human terms. The response of the Most High was not merely the confusion of languages, it was a devastating legal disinheritance. The original Hebrew of Deuteronomy states that God divided the nations and fixed their borders according to the number of the sons of God. These sons of God, the Bene Elohim, were not human beings. They were powerful, unearthly intelligences, spiritual administrators assigned to govern the fractured nations of the earth. Humanity had rejected the direct rule of the Creator, so the Creator handed them over to the administration of lesser, though magnificent, spiritual beings. However, the tragedy of the ancient cosmos is that these administrative entities became corrupt. Psalm 82 documents a terrifying scene in the supreme court of heaven, where the God of Israel stands in the divine assembly and judges these very gods, condemning them for ruling with darkness, accepting corrupt sacrifices, and demanding the worship that belonged only to the uncreated sovereign. These fallen administrators are the entities that the ancient world knew as the gods of the nations. They are the pantheons of Egypt, of Babylon, of Greece, and of Phoenicia. They are conscious, calculating, and hungry for human allegiance, because human worship is the currency of the spiritual realm. It grants them legal jurisdiction over physical territories. But in the midst of this global disinheritance, Yahweh did something unprecedented. He chose one man, Abraham, out of the darkness of Ur, and from his seed, he created a new nation entirely from scratch. Israel was the sole, exclusive portion of the Most High. It was the only geographical and spiritual territory on the face of the earth directly governed by the Creator, completely bypassing the corrupt administration of the fallen sons of God. This brings us to the true, horrifying reality of Jezebel's crime. She was not merely a woman bringing foreign statues across the border. When she established the massive, state-funded temples to Baal and Asherah in the heart of Samaria, she was orchestrating an illegal cosmic ground invasion. She was taking the fallen, disinherited entities that had jurisdiction over the coastal empire of Tyre and inviting them to establish a localized, sovereign footprint within the exact territory that Yahweh had reserved for himself. She was offering the blood, the soil, and the souls of the Israelites as a legal sacrifice to expand the territorial dominion of the lords of the underworld. When Elijah fled into the desert, it was because the veil had been torn back. On Mount Carmel, he had successfully executed the human priesthood. He had destroyed the biological hardware of the Canaanite religion. But the dark, pulsing software of the abyss, the actual, living principality of Baal, remained entirely intact. Elijah realized that he could kill 1,000 priests, but he could not kill a spirit with a sword. The queen's chilling oath, invoking the immortal curses of her gods despite their public humiliation, revealed that her soul was perfectly, inextricably merged with this ancient intelligence. We must examine the terrifying mechanism of this demonic symbiosis. The modern mind often defaults to Hollywood caricatures of possession, convulsions, unnatural voices, a complete loss of human agency. But the ancient texts reveal a far more insidious and sophisticated reality. True spiritual assimilation does not look like madness. It looks like cold, calculated, untouchable brilliance. It is the architecture of a corporate merger. When a human being, especially one in a position of ultimate executive power, continually and willfully opens the doorways of their mind to an ancient darkness, a legal contract is formed in the unseen realm. The human vessel becomes a physical tuning fork, resonating perfectly with the frequency of the abyss. The entity does not override the human personality. It empowers it, sharpens it, and weaponizes it. The intellect of the queen, her political genius, her absolute absence of empathy, and her unyielding resolve were the direct results of this dark communion. She was the perfect biological avatar for a cosmic warlord. She was no longer just a Phoenician princess. She was an autonomous walking temple of the adversary. This explains why the early Christian church, the men and women who lived in the immediate centuries following the resurrection, did not view the stories of the Old Testament as mere history. They understood that the entities operating behind the ancient kings and queens were still intensely active in their own time. The Apostle Paul, writing in Greek to the church in Ephesus, explicitly codified this terrifying reality. He warned that the ultimate battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The original Greek terminology Paul utilizes is chillingly precise. He does not use generic terms for petty demons. He uses words like archos, meaning ancient, primordial magistrates. He uses exousias, meaning delegated, high-ranking authorities holding specific jurisdictions. And he uses Kosmokratoros, a terrifying compound word that translates conceptually to the world rulers of this present darkness, the unseen directors of geopolitical and cultural machinery. Paul is describing an organized, highly structured military bureaucracy of the unseen realm. The entity that wore the crown of Jezebel in the 9th century before Christ was a Kosmokrator, a world ruler of darkness that utilized her flesh to attempt the total eradication of the bloodline from which the Messiah was prophesied to come. If she had succeeded in exterminating every prophet and replacing the worship of Yahweh entirely with the cult of Baal, the covenant would have been shattered, and the mechanism of human salvation would have been aborted. Her war was not local. It was an apocalyptic strike against the redemption of humanity. The profound danger of our modern era is that we have collectively chosen to forget this. We have suffered a doctrinal lobotomy. In our arrogance, we believe that because we have mapped the human genome, split the atom, and connected the globe with fiber optics, we have somehow outgrown the ancient principalities. We assume that because we no longer see physical statues of Baal in our city squares, the entity himself has simply ceased to exist. But spiritual forces do not die when their statues are smashed. They simply change their methodology. They adapt to the cultural landscape, finding new avatars, new philosophies, and new architectures of rebellion to inhabit. This brings us to the most unsettling, paradigm-shattering paradox in the entirety of the biblical text. The historical woman named Jezebel died. Her flesh was consumed by the scavenging dogs in the dirt of the Jezreel Valley. Her skull and her palms were left as a gruesome testament to the fulfillment of divine judgment. Human logic dictates that her story ends there, but the scriptures refuse to let her remain in the grave. Fast forward, over 900 years. The physical landscape of the world has drastically changed. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires have risen and fallen into dust. The iron legions of Rome now dominate the known world. In the late 1st century AD, the Apostle John is exiled on the brutal volcanic penal colony of Patmos, a rocky prison in the Aegean Sea. Here, he experiences a violent, reality-tearing revelation of the resurrected, glorified Christ. Christ dictates 7 distinct, heavily coded letters to 7 actual historical churches located in the Roman province of Asia, modern-day Turkey. When the voice of the sovereign of the universe addresses the church in the city of Thyatira, he issues a commendation for their love, their service, and their faith. But then, the tone of the divine dictation shifts into a register of terrifying severity. The resurrected Christ looks directly into the spiritual architecture of this early Christian community and identifies a catastrophic internal breach. He says, "I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." This is a moment of profound, chilling theological shock. 9 centuries have passed. The Phoenician queen has been dead for nearly a millennium. Yet, the omniscient creator of the universe uses her exact, specific name to identify a living, breathing threat operating inside a first-century church. He does not say someone acting like her. He does not say a woman with a similar personality. He says, that woman Jezebel. How are we to understand this? The shallow, traditional interpretation attempts to soften the blow by claiming this is merely a metaphor, a poetic nickname used by Jesus to describe an anonymous woman in the congregation who was causing trouble. But to reduce this terrifying decree to a mere metaphor is to ignore the strict, precise mechanics of spiritual reality we have just established. The biblical text operates on the terrifying law of spiritual continuity. The entity, the Kosmokrator, the specific principality of seduction, idolatry, and control that had engineered the symbiosis with the ancient Queen of Israel, had never died. It had simply remained dormant in the unseen realm, waiting for the perfect environment, the perfect cultural pressure, and the perfect human vessel to resume its war against the covenant. The spirit of Jezebel had resurrected, not in the royal palaces of a secular kingdom, but far more dangerously within the very sanctuary of the Christian church. She had returned, wearing the mask of a prophetess, utilizing the vocabulary of faith, and claiming to possess a higher, deeper revelation of God. To understand the devastating effectiveness of her new strategy, we must examine the specific socio-economic environment of the city of Thyatira. Thyatira was not a center of massive political power or grand imperial worship, like Pergamum or Ephesus. It was a blue-collar, industrial powerhouse. It was famous across the Roman world for its extensive network of trade guilds. There were guilds for the bronze smiths, the weavers, the tanners, and the dyers of purple cloth. In the 1st century, these trade guilds were the absolute center of economic survival. If you were not a member of a guild, you could not buy materials, you could not sell your goods, and you could not feed your family. You were effectively locked out of the economy. But guild membership was not merely a secular business arrangement. It was deeply, inherently religious. Every guild had a patron deity. To attend the mandatory guild meetings meant you had to participate in the ceremonial feasts, which involved eating meat that had been ritually sacrificed to pagan gods, usually Apollo Terimnios, the patron sun god of the city. Furthermore, these feasts routinely devolved into organized, ritualized sexual immorality, a continuation of the ancient fertility rites of Canaan disguised in Greco-Roman garments. For the early Christians living in Thyatira, this presented an agonizing, impossible dilemma. To remain faithful to the exclusive, holy demands of Christ meant refusing to participate in the guild feasts. To refuse participation meant losing your guild membership. To lose your membership meant immediate, devastating poverty, starvation, and social absolute ostracization. The pressure to compromise was not just a matter of peer pressure, it was a matter of physical survival. Into this crucible of economic terror steps the new avatar of the ancient queen. She rises within the congregation, claiming to speak with the authority of the Holy Spirit. And she offers the terrified Christians exactly what their flesh desperately wanted to hear, a theological loophole. The text tells us she taught and seduced the servants of God. Seduction in the spiritual realm rarely looks like a frontal assault. It looks like an intellectual compromise that feels like relief. She did not tell them to renounce Christ. That would have been too obvious. The church would have immediately rejected her. The spirit of Jezebel is infinitely more sophisticated than brute force. Instead, she introduced a subtle, poisonous doctrine of dualism, a precursor to the Gnostic heresies that would soon plague the early church. We can reverse engineer her teachings based on the specific condemnation of Christ. She likely taught that because salvation is a matter of the spirit, what a person does with their physical body does not truly matter. She argued that an enlightened Christian, possessing the true knowledge of grace, could attend the pagan guild feasts, eat the sacrificed meat, and participate in the cultural immorality without actually defiling their pure inner soul. She provided a religious justification for economic survival at the cost of covenantal holiness. She taught them that they could synchronize, that they could halt between two opinions. It is the exact same architectural poison she forced upon the Israelites on Mount Carmel, repackaged with a Christian vocabulary. In the 9th century BC, she used the sword of the state to force Israel to bow to the gods of the world. In the 1st century AD, she used the crushing weight of the economy and the twisting of doctrine to convince the church to voluntarily climb into bed with the gods of the world. The depth of this doctrinal poison is revealed in a terrifying phrase used by Christ himself in the letter. He states that those who follow her teachings claim to know the deep things of Satan, the Tabbathea tu Satana. This is a staggering revelation. The followers of this false prophetess believed they were experiencing the deep things of God. They believed they had unlocked a secret, elite level of spiritual maturity that allowed them to navigate the darkness of the Roman world without being harmed by it. But the sovereign eyes of the resurrected Christ pierce through the delusion and identify the true source of this knowledge. It was not a revelation of grace. It was an initiation into the abyssal depths of the adversary. The doctrine of Jezebel is the ultimate weaponization of tolerance. It is the insidious belief that the holy, burning exclusivity of God can be negotiated. It is the lie that we can dine at the table of demons on Saturday and drink from the cup of the Lord on Sunday without invoking the terrifying, uncreated fire of divine judgment. And the most horrifying aspect of this hidden battle is that the entity found a willing audience inside the walls of the sanctuary. The believers in Thyatira were not conquered by a foreign army. They were seduced by a familiar voice holding a Bible, whispering that the law of God is malleable when your survival is on the line. The ancient war had never ended. The battleground had simply relocated from the dust of the Jezreel Valley directly into the minds and the theology of the faithful. We must understand that the ancient blueprint laid down in the dirt of Samaria is the exact schematic for the closing moments of human history. The conflict at Thyatira was merely a localized prototype, a beta test for an apocalyptic endgame. The entity that engineered the slaughter of the prophets and the seduction of the early church is currently executing the final phases of a global eschatological operation. Modern humanity, in its profound technological arrogance, believes it has sterilized the world of ancient gods. We look at our towering skyscrapers of glass and steel, our global financial networks, and our instantaneous digital communications, and we assume we have constructed a purely secular, enlightened reality. But secularism is the greatest and most sophisticated illusion ever cast over the human mind. The principalities did not flee from the Industrial Revolution or the digital age. They embedded themselves deeply within them. The spirit that wore the crown of ivory in the 9th century before Christ does not need you to bow before a carved Asherah pole in a sacred grove today. It only requires your silent participation in its synchronized systems. It demands the exact same psychological and spiritual surrender that it demanded from the ancient Israelites. Today, the altars are not made of stone drenched in physical blood. They are constructed from the dogmas of absolute moral relativity, the systematic deconstruction of objective truth, and the aggressive, institutionalized demand that the holy exclusivity of God be sacrificed on the altar of universal tolerance. If you dare to stand in the modern public square and declare the absolute, unyielding boundaries of divine law, you will immediately feel the kinetic, suffocating pressure of the exact same entity that hunted Elijah into the deep desert. The methodologies have evolved from literal swords to social, economic, and digital exile. but the underlying ancient hatred remains identical. To grasp the terrifying climax of this spiritual war, we must turn to the final chapters of the apocalyptic visions of John. In the 17th chapter of the book of Revelation, the curtain is violently pulled back to reveal the ultimate, culminating manifestation of this dark principality. John is carried away in the spirit into a desolate wilderness, and he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. The text describes her with a specificity that perfectly, chillingly, mirrors the ancient queen of Israel. She is arrayed in purple and scarlet color, adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She holds a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And written upon her forehead is a name of profound esoteric mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. This is not a description of a literal biological woman. In the prophetic language of the Apocalypse, a woman operating in this capacity represents a vast spiritual, religious, and geopolitical architecture. This is the final, globalized manifestation of the Jezebel principality. The ancient queen brought the bloody idolatry of Phoenicia to a single nation. The false prophetess of Thyatira brought it to a local congregation. But Mystery Babylon represents the entire synchronized global system operating under the absolute dominion of the adversary. Notice the terrifying detail John records as he stares at this entity. He says, "I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." This is the exact unholy signature of the ancient queen. Just as she slaughtered the prophets of Yahweh to silence the voice of the covenant, the final manifestation of this spirit will execute a global, systematic eradication of anyone who holds to the testimony of the true Creator. She is drunk on their blood, a grotesque demonic inversion of the communion cup. She consumes the life of the righteous as an act of cosmic defiance, celebrating the death of the holy as a triumphant victory for the abyss. We must carefully examine the mechanics of how this final empire will operate, because the blueprint was already demonstrated in the ancient trade guilds of Thyatira. Remember the economic terror used to force the early Christians into spiritual compromise. In the 13th chapter of Revelation, we are given the administrative framework of the final beast system. The prophecy declares that it causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast. This is the Thyatira guild system expanded to a planetary, inescapable scale. The spirit of Jezebel has always operated through monopoly, absolute control, and the weaponization of human survival. In the closing days of history, the financial systems of the earth will be completely integrated with the spiritual worship of the Antichrist system. You will not be able to participate in the global economy. You will not be able to purchase food, secure housing, or generate income unless you publicly synchronize with the state-sponsored idolatry. The technological infrastructure to implement such an inescapable digital embargo exists right now, pulsing silently through the fiber-optic veins of our modern world. But the technology is merely dead machinery. The ghost in the machine, the ancient calculating intelligence driving the world toward this absolute control grid, is the same principality that forged the seal of Ahab. It is forcing humanity into the ultimate terrifying ultimatum: starve in the wasteland or eat at the table of the demon gods. To understand how this system targets the righteous, we must recall the dark historical incident of Naboth's vineyard. King Ahab wanted the ancestral land of a man named Naboth merely to use it as a vegetable garden. Naboth refused, not out of stubbornness, but because it was his covenantal inheritance, given by God, which the ancient law strictly forbade him to sell. When the king sulked in his palace, it was the queen who took immediate, lethal action. She orchestrated a mock trial, utilizing the king's seal to hire false witnesses who accused Naboth of blaspheming God and the king. Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death, allowing the state to legally confiscate his blood-soaked land. This is a terrifying prophetic blueprint for how the final system will treat the saints of God. The spirit of Jezebel utilizes the legal, judicial, and political frameworks of the state to criminalize righteousness. In the closing days of this age, the true followers of Christ will not be persecuted as noble martyrs. They will be prosecuted as enemies of the state, as dangerous obstacles to global unity, and as purveyors of hate who refuse to surrender their theological inheritance. The system will create mock trials in the court of public opinion, utilizing the false witnesses of mass media and a synchronized, corrupted culture to declare the faithful as extremists. The ultimate goal is always the theft of the inheritance. The enemy wants to strip the bride of Christ of her spiritual authority, her voice, and her presence in the earth, burying her in the dirt just as they buried Naboth, so that the machinery of the beast can expand without friction. But the cosmic architecture of God is symmetrical, and his justice is terrifyingly precise. If the principality of Jezebel operates until the very end of the age, then the divine countermeasure, the spirit of Elijah, must also be deployed. The prophet Malachi, writing the final haunting words of the Old Testament before the heavens go silent for 400 years, delivers an explosive promise. He declares, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." The ancient rabbis and the early church fathers understood this not merely as a metaphor, but as a literal, eschatological reality. In the 11th chapter of Revelation, during the darkest, most terrifying period of the Great Tribulation, God raises up two witnesses. These are not politicians, nor are they diplomatic religious leaders seeking common ground. They are described as the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth, and the power granted to them is a direct, undeniable mirror of the ancient showdown on Mount Carmel. The text says they have power to shut heaven, so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. The war of the 9th century before Christ is going to be fought again, but this time the stage is the entire globe, and the audience is every living soul. The modern world is currently caught in the exact same paralyzing, chaotic dance as the ancient Israelites. We are halting between two opinions, attempting to limp between the Holy Covenant and the dark, intoxicating rituals of a dying age. But the eschatological timeline is accelerating, and the middle ground is violently collapsing. The gray areas of compromise are being evaporated by the escalating heat of the spiritual war. The final prophetic voices will not come to negotiate a peace treaty with the modern iterations of Baal. They will come to force the entire planet into the valley of decision. The illusions of human autonomy and technological supreme power will be stripped away, revealing the raw, terrifying reality of a world under divine embargo. And just as the ancient queen reacted to the fire from heaven with an oath of pure demonic rage, the final global empire will not repent when it sees the wrath of God. The text of Revelation records that they will blaspheme the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and they will stubbornly refuse to repent of their deeds. The principality of Jezebel cannot be reformed. It cannot be educated. It can only be utterly consumed by the uncreated fire of the final judgment. Yet the most terrifying aspect of the prophetic consequences is what happens inside the individual human soul. Christ's warning to Thyatira remains active, echoing across the centuries with the force of a lethal command. He said, "Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts." This is the devastating reality of the holy. God does not merely judge external actions. He X-rays the deepest, most hidden architecture of human motivation. He searches the kidneys and the heart, the ancient anatomical idioms for the deepest seat of secret loyalties. If you carry the doctrine of compromise within you, if you secretly believe that you can outsmart the demands of the covenant to secure your own survival in a hostile world, you are already drinking from her cup. The sickness that Christ threatens is the spiritual necrosis that occurs when a soul is completely handed over to its own deceptions. When the final global manifestation of Mystery Babylon rises, those who have spent their lives practicing the small, quiet compromises of Thyatira will naturally, effortlessly step into the grand, fatal synchronization of the mark of the beast. They will not recognize the Antichrist system as a threat, because they have already been trained by the spirit of the ancient queen to see compromise as wisdom and treason as survival. The machinery is already built. The stage is perfectly set. The world is sleepwalking into the arms of the ancient mother of harlots, hypnotized by the promise of peace, extreme tolerance, and economic security, entirely unaware that the golden cup she offers is filled with the venom of the abyss. We are standing on the precipice of the final apocalyptic realization of the Jezreel Valley. We have fundamentally forgotten the terrifying nature of the holy. The modern religious experiment has spent centuries attempting to domesticate the uncreated God, stripping away the blinding, lethal realities of his jurisprudence to construct a deity of infinite accommodation. We have replaced the paralyzing, knee-buckling fear of the Lord with a cheap, casual familiarity. But the ancient texts do not offer us a celestial therapist. They introduce us to a consuming fire. To stand in the presence of Yahweh is to stand at the edge of a cosmic singularity, a concentration of absolute purity that violently incinerates everything unauthorized, everything compromised, and everything that bears the watermark of the abyss. The true fear of God is not a polite reverence. It is the crushing, existential realization of our own profound fragility in the face of an immutable, uncompromising law. When we look back at the blood-soaked earth of the Jezreel Valley, we are forced to confront the supreme illusion of human autonomy. The Phoenician queen believed she was the architect of her own reality. She commanded the wealth of the Mediterranean. She directed the geopolitical machinery of a nation. And she weaponized the minds of thousands. In her final moments, as the executioners marched up the stairs of her winter palace, she painted her eyes and arranged her hair. It was the ultimate, grotesque display of mortal defiance, an attempt to project sovereignty even as the walls closed in. But what is human sovereignty when the clock of divine probation finally expires? The moment her body shattered against the cobblestones, the vast, intricate empire she had built in her mind evaporated into nothing. This is the terrifying destiny of all human pride. We construct our elaborate towers of intellect, wealth, and philosophy, believing we have fortified ourselves against the demands of eternity. We seal our own documents of state, completely forgetting that the physical world is nothing more than a thin, porous membrane stretched over an unfathomable spiritual abyss. There is a cold, transactional ruthlessness to the dark entities that govern this present age. The principalities of the air, the rulers of the darkness that seduce the human mind with promises of power, enlightenment, and liberation, do not possess the capacity for loyalty. They do not love the human vessels they inhabit. The ancient gods of the storm, the entities to whom the queen sacrificed the blood of the innocent and the wealth of her nation, did not ride out from the clouds to save her. When the decree of heaven was spoken, they abandoned her to the scavenging dogs. The spirits that fuel human rebellion are entirely parasitic. They feed on the hostility of the host, they weaponize the intellect, and they drive the soul into a state of total, localized warfare against the Creator. But the moment the unalterable judgment of God falls, these cosmic architects of treason retreat into the shadows, leaving the naked, terrified human soul to face the full, unmitigated severity of the infinite alone. You are making a blood pact with an intelligence that is patiently waiting for the exact moment of your absolute destruction. The universe is not a democratic experiment. It is a vast, absolute monarchy governed by a fixed, unalterable axis of truth. When a mortal soul, bound by time and enclosed in flesh, chooses to synchronize with the ancient rebellion, they are not merely adopting a different cultural perspective. They are entering their own name into a legal ledger of cosmic treason. And the ledger of heaven is meticulously kept. Every hidden compromise, every silent bowing of the knee to the sanitized altars of the modern age, Every rationalization that twists the holy text to accommodate the desires of the flesh is recorded in the deafening, absolute silence of eternity. We are dust that has been granted the terrifying, lethal privilege of choice. But we do not get to choose the consequences of the spiritual laws we trigger. The dogs of Jezreel left only the skull, the feet, and the palms of the hands. It is a monument of absence, a negative space in the archaeological record of humanity that screams a terrifying, inescapable truth. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. There is no negotiation at the threshold of eternity. There is no legal loophole to be found when the breath leaves the lungs and the soul is abruptly pulled into the blinding light of the divine courtroom. The dust of the ancient world is still blowing across the valleys of the earth. The spirits that orchestrated the slaughter of the prophets are still whispering through the infrastructure of our modern reality, offering the exact same cup of abominations. The war never ended. The decree has already been written, and the vast, terrifying machinery of divine justice is quietly, methodically turning its gears in the dark, waiting for the hour to strike.